The business cycle in developed nations is a pattern where there are periods of economic growth followed by periods of slowing growth and even falling growth. So it's a cycle. What does a cycle look like? Ooh, it looks like that. Up and down and up and down and up and down, okay? And this is known as the business cycle or trade cycle. Definition. The business cycle is the periodic fluctuations in economic activity measured by changes in, there it is, real GDP. So that's GDP or GNP, but we usually use GDP. You can use both. But GDP with what does real mean? Inflation's taken into account, okay? So the phases of the business cycle are known as peak, contraction, trough, and expansion, and all of those terms are defined in the notes that associate this video. So while the fluctuations are, in practice, highly irregular, the most common illustration of the business cycle shows a standard periodic cycle of highs and lows, okay? With a very important, like 45-degree angle line that comes out of the origin, we'll look at it in a second, that talks about the potential growth. So let's take a look at the business cycle, and boom, there it is, okay? And this particular business cycle diagram is excellent, and it's taken from Jocelyn Blink and Ian Dorton's excellent IB economics course companion. It's the book that is the basis of all of the bundles that you might buy here at the econ school. This particular course of macroeconomics depends on it heavily, and the reason is that her work and Ian Dorton's work is excellent. So I took this graph from her because it's so easy to understand. Okay, so let's take a look. Okay, first of all, boom, take a look at this line coming out of more or less the origin, right? And it's going roughly at a 45-degree angle. What does that say? That is something called the long-term growth trend. What does that mean? This blue dotted line equals the best possible economic growth of a country over time. So on the vertical axis, we have real GDP, and on the horizontal axis, we have time. It is a reference between the real GDP, the growth, the economic growth, the business cycle, economic growth over time versus time, okay, over time. So if a country, think back to the beginning of this unit when we talked about the ideal economic growth is 2% per year, then what you would have is a growth line that's not wiggly squiggly like that, but rather is flat. And that flatness is the ideal. It's the potential. It's where the government wants to keep the economy. It is what is the goal of 2% growth, okay? So real GDP, if it were to be 2% every year, it would just be a linear growth line. However, we know that's not true, right? And what happens? Well, sometimes economic growth is less than 2%. Sometimes it's more than 2%. Sometimes it's less than 2%. Sometimes it's more. By the way, both are bad. Did you hear that? Both are bad. If there's only 1% growth, the economy is not growing quick enough. If there's 4% growth, the economy is growing too fast. Too fast for what? For it to be sustainable. Too fast for wages. If the economy is growing at 4%, that means inflation is 4%. And if everybody's getting roughly a 2% pay raise every year, guess what? They're not going to be able to keep up to the cost of inflation. So while it's really advantageous for politicians to talk about all this economic growth beyond 2% in a developed nation, guess what? That's bad. So be smarter. You know now why 2% growth is bad. And more than 2% growth is bad because it's not sustainable. There's going to be, you know it, a trough. Okay? So the government's goal is to, and this is really important, is to eliminate this trough right here. And also to eliminate this boom. And to eliminate this trough, and to eliminate this boom. Everything that's blue that I just drew on there, it would be better if it didn't exist. You see that? It would be better if it didn't exist. It would be better for a country if their business cycle looked like that, right? Lower highs and higher lows would look like that. And as a result of that, the country would be keeping itself more closely attached to where they want to be, right? Which is a long-term growth trend right there, that black line. Okay? So that's pretty interesting, right? The business cycle is a cycle that's almost unavoidable. And one of the reasons why it's unavoidable is economists and governments are always using information that's a little bit too old, like 2 months or 3 months too old. So you're never really sure what's actually happening in an economy at any given time because you don't actually have the data of what's happening right now. At best, you have last month's data, and that's already pretty flawed. Okay? So what the governments need to do is then they have, and I mentioned this in the beginning, these fiscal and monetary policies to manage this growth, this real GDP, because this red line is the real GDP over time. Okay? Red line, the original red line is real GDP over time. Okay, now I'm going to show you this next slide, and it's excellent, and it comes from Ellie Tregeges, who is the woman who is in charge of all IB economics. She put together another very expansive and excellent course companion. And here it is here. Now, this is going to blow your mind a little bit. It might overwhelm you, but what I think is really helpful is to show you this expanded version of the business cycle so that you can understand the intricacies and how the business cycle leads or impacts economic growth. It impacts, as a result of it impacting economic growth, it impacts inflation, and as a result of growth, there's also a lot of jobs created, so it impacts unemployment. What's really important is if you take a look at this particular business cycle. Now here, her dotted line, this is the long-term growth trend, right? Or the potential GDP equaling full level of employment of GDP, which is where unemployment equals the natural rate of unemployment. What does that mean? That sounds confusing. Now, this line right here represents 2% growth, 2% inflation, and 5% unemployment. That's the ideal. Remember, the ideal situation for a government is 2% growth, 2% inflation, 5% unemployment. That growth line is ideal. This would be 2% growth, 2% inflation, and 5% unemployment. And if you know that, then you realize that if the actual real GDP, which is the solid green line here, is above the potential growth line, what does that say about economic growth? Economic growth is more than 2%. That's bad. That would lead to inflation that's more than 2%. That's bad. And it would lead to, and this is where you can mess up, but that would lead to a lot more people having jobs than the government actually wants to have, and that means an unemployment rate, say, of 3%. 3% unemployment is bad? Yes, it is. Why? Because it'll lead to too much growth and too much inflation, and therefore, what the government wants to do is some policy to pull the economy back down to the potential growth line, which is 2, 2, and 5. Okay? So if you look at this point D here, this is where actual GDP is greater than the potential GDP. And that means there's an output gap. The output gap is anything above or below the actual potential GDP line. Okay? So unemployment is less than the natural rate of employment, meaning 3%. Right? And also growth would be above 2%. Inflation would be above 2%, and unemployment would be below 5%, okay? So the government's going to do some sort of fiscal or monetary contractionary policies to slow the economy down, and then that happens, and what happens? We get to a point E. And here at point E, because we are below the ideal, and the ideal is 2% growth, 2% inflation, 5% unemployment. If we're below it, then we're going to have growth that's less than 2%. We're going to have inflation that's less than 2%. And we're going to have unemployment that's more than 5%. And sure enough, check it out. Actual GDP, when it's less than potential GDP, there's an output gap. That's this whole area right here, where unemployment is greater than the natural rate of unemployment, which means it's around 8%. I always tell students, just make it 8. 8% unemployment is bad. Right? 1% growth is bad, 1% inflation's bad, and so is 8% unemployment. So the government's going to do some sort of expansionary fiscal monetary policy, and then it's going to get back to C, and at point C, just like at point B, just like at point A there, what happened? You had 2, 2, and 5. 2 growth, 2 inflation, 5 unemployment, 5% unemployment, and we're back to this long-term growth trend, which is the ideal. Okay? Wow, isn't that cool? Like in one diagram, the business cycle, you can take those overall macroeconomic goals of a government, of economic growth at 2%, inflation at 2%, unemployment at 5%, and demonstrate them right there. And then you see how this whole matrix of macroeconomics comes together. And my friends, this is just the beginning. This is just the foundations of macroeconomics. This is just where it begins, right? And you will see, and it'll continue to enlighten and enliven and deepen your life in understanding the world around you. All right, we'll see you in the next video, my friends.